Hello, Pamela. How are you?
Good, Peter. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for joining us. Sorry about that inevitable Zoom glitch that seems to happen
Part of it.
all the time, whether it's with our kids at school or,
Right.
but we're here. So thanks so much for joining us on the Marsy's Law interview series, Why We Do What We Do. This is an interview series that we started really at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, and we've been going all the way through, and we've been highlighting and spotlighting people in the victims' rights movement, and really kind of digging deeply into why it is they are in the victims' rights space and what it is that inspires them to do the work that they do. You are the victim outreach coordinator for Marsy's Law in Idaho, but you're also a writer, a teacher, an author, a researcher, a victim and trauma advocacy expert at this point. And one of the things that your research has shown is the power, the healing and the therapeutic power of storytelling, and you refer to it as narrative therapy.
Yes.
And we'll get into that in a little bit, but I think the most important story right now is for you to tell us your story. And it starts a long time ago in the family tree, your family tree, and it began with your mom being a victim of abuse. Could you start and tell us about that?
Sure. I think my story is a great example of how violence, relationship violence especially, can stay with someone across the course of a lifetime. So mine started before I was born, basically while I was conceived. My mom was 16, grew up in a very conservative family. And at 16, she felt like she wanted out. And her plan for getting out was to get pregnant. And she said, I picked the James Dean of the school. And she said I was successful. She became pregnant with me. And my biological father was not quite as a willing participant in her plan. And he became very violent with her. And the violence was focused on trying to force basically a miscarriage to end the pregnancy. And so my experience with violence began really in utero, and I'm studying neuropsych right now. And one of the things that has always rung true with me is how I kind of came out into this world with a neurological system, an autonomic nervous system that was really primed for violence because of my mom's experiences.
And you became a victim of abuse yourself at the age of 5.
Yeah, my mom was smart. You know, she was young, but she was smart. She left my biological father before I was 1, when I was still young. No one knows what went on early with me with him, but between the ages of 5 and 7, my best friend's father sexually assaulted me for a period. I don't have exact time frame for this, but a period between the ages of 5 and 7 for at least a year.
And this started when you were 5 years old?
It was in that range. So I have pretty good memory of my kindergarten teacher and some of my first grade teacher. I have no memory of my second grade teachers. So I believe, and the therapists I've worked with believe, that it was probably in that six-year-old range.
Yeah, and one of the things that I know that you know and that we've learned, and recently in one of these interviews, Jennifer Storm, the victim advocate for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, talked about the fact that these traumatic experiences can lead to all sorts of different destructive behaviors as far as coping mechanisms go. And you were no exception when it came to that.
That's true. So, I mean, trauma unresolved leads to adaptive responses that become maladaptive. And for me, I didn't disclose what was happening to me. I was told to keep it a secret, and I did. I didn't want to upset my parents. I knew it was wrong, and I think a big part of me carried shame. So the way that it manifested for me is I became very phobic of any type of romantic relationship. And I did fine up until about age 12 when I entered junior high. And then I began, like all girls that age, to develop. And I became very uncomfortable with the attention that brought me from males.
And
sorry, go ahead, Peter.
And you didn't, so you were afraid to get into any kind of a relationship with a boy when you were, even when you were 16 years old?
Very much so. So all my girlfriends were dating and doing all the things that teenage girls do, and I was not. And I had selected a women's college that I intended to go to when I graduated from high school, hadn't had any type of romantic relationship. It was just, I was completely avoidant. And as the end of high school approached around 16, 17, it felt like I was more and more out of control. And I had received some unwanted attention from a male teacher. And for me, it took the form of anorexia. And I didn't understand at the time why. Looking back, I realized that it was a way for me unconsciously to kind of stop that sexual development process that I wasn't psychologically prepared for. And the only real positive thing that came out of that is when I went into treatment for anorexia, it was the first time that anyone had noted, because I read my chart notes when I shouldn't have, that there was probably sexual assault history in my childhood. So that was the first time there was ever conscious awareness from anyone else about what I had experienced.
And you said you dropped to something like 70 pounds at some point.
Yeah, I'm not very big. I'm 5'2" when I'm sitting up straight. But yeah, I dropped my sophomore year in college, I dropped to 78 pounds. It was life-threatening at that point. And
so you struggled to get back on your feet from a health perspective and from a relationship perspective. And at some point, you had a very serious relationship with a very successful man, and you got married.
I did. So the trauma from childhood wasn't addressed during treatment for the anorexia. And so I just kind of slid out of that and right into my first serious relationship when I was about 22. He was 12 years older than me. He was actually a client of mine. I was working in marketing at the time. And 12 years older, very successful, part of a large family business. And we were married within a year.
And after that, within the first few months, there was one day when your then husband said to you, let's just enjoy the day together and let's blow off work and let's just go golfing for the day. But you had a really busy day that day. So you told him, that wasn't what you were going to be planning for the day. And tell us what happened at that point.
So I had just started a business, my own business, and was classic perfectionist. And he woke up that day. He was very flexible in his work schedule. And he said, hey, let's go golfing today. And I told him, sorry, honey, I have clients planned for the day and I don't want to cancel them at the last minute. Could we plan another time? And it was like, Peter, a light switch went off. And this man that I had married that was generally fun-loving, we were in our dressing rooms and he picked up a hairbrush and he threw the hairbrush at my head and missed, and told me that he knew I'd be like this when I married him and that I had better get my priorities straight or he'd be divorcing me. And he called me a very vile name, something I had never heard another human being say out loud. And he stormed out of the house.
And you gathered yourself at some point, and instead of leaving or addressing him and telling him not to treat you like that, your instincts were totally different. In fact, you apologized to him.
I did. I came from a family where marriages lasted. My parents just celebrated their 54th wedding anniversary. My grandparents before my grandfather passed, had been married for almost 50 years. And so I felt like it was my responsibility to make this right. He was 12 years older than me. He had been married before. I thought he understood relationships in a way that I didn't. So I remember sitting there, sink up against the tub, and I finally just wiped the mascara out from under my eyes and thought, I'm going to make this right. And I'm going to let him know that I put our marriage first above my ambition and my career. And I walked outside to where he was in his shop and I apologized to him. And I said, I'm sorry. And I want you to know that I love you and I'll always put you first. And I'll cancel my clients and we'll go golfing. And the light switch went on again. And he was happy and we went golfing that day and he had a great time. I was, I think, in shock looking back, but what I didn't realize, Peter, that I had done is lay down a template, right? That I would travel over in a cycle over and over again for the next 10 years that we were married, where he would become abusive and violent with me. And I would take responsibility for his behavior. He would blame me. I would take responsibility to try to make things right. And off we would go again and again and again through this template of behavior.
So you unintentionally had laid out a template for this abusive behavior and this blueprint for the way each of these incidents were going to play out, and it almost created a permission structure for him.
Absolutely, great way to describe it. It was a permission structure. And I didn't know it at the time. I hadn't worked in this field, but I mean, it's a classic pattern in these relationships of violence where we look at a blow up, a honeymoon, a build up, a blow up, just over and over and over again.
And a lot of people who are blessed to have never been involved in relationships that have any kind of abuse, or people who maybe just see these things on television, say, why would you stay with him? Why did you stay with him? But you talked to me about a couple of reasons. One, you just talked about the fact that you actually took your vows very seriously. This is the way that you were wired from your parents and your grandparents. But there was another reason that he had threatened you if you had ever left.
He did. That was the time that the O.J. Simpson civil trial was going on. And he told me that if I ever left, that he would O.J. me. And I knew that he meant it. So, you know, I always train when I'm teaching. Victims have very good reasons why they stay in these relationships. And as advocates for them, we need to listen to their reasons and help them work through those very real issues. So there were a lot of them, but those were the main ones. I mean, it was for better, for worse. I was in. I thought I could make it better. I kept trying for 10 years. I was ashamed that as a caring, educated woman that I had allowed myself to get into this position. I believed him that no one would ever love me like he would. And I believed him that he would kill me if I left.
And so you were ashamed and afraid. And so you stayed. And you said that there was an alcohol issue as well. And one of the things when you and I talked about this interview, you said that you thought that, well, maybe if I could get him sober, then that might help. And we might be able to get through it that way. But then there was one night that he hit you and you finally moved out.
I did.
And he came and apologized and wanted to bring you back and brought you gifts.
Yep. So like most people in these relationships, I left and came back and left and came back. But there was one time that was awful. I mean, they were all awful, but it was particularly awful. And I actually moved out, rented an apartment, and he showed up apologizing, trying to get me to come back, saying he'd do anything, including going to alcohol abuse treatment and counseling. I think even that didn't do it though, Peter. What was finally the turning point for me is he showed up one day and he was just saying everything I needed to hear about how he was taking responsibility, how his behavior had impacted me. And that was really what convinced me to come back that time. And he didn't disclose until later that he had found journals that I was keeping during that marriage where I was writing about the violence between us. And he had read them, and he was basically just saying what I needed to hear from him that he had read. And it wasn't sincere.
Because at the time you thought that there was a real connection there, because he was actually parroting your innermost thoughts and reflections. And at the time you were engaging in your own narrative therapy without knowing that you were going to ultimately teach it as narrative therapy.
That's exactly right. So what I found about the journals, I mean, I've always been a writer ever since I was, little, but what I found the journals did is I was so numb and so dissociated during that relationship that the journals where I could document what was going on, it helped me make sense of my life. It helped me put the pieces together, and it gave me an outlet for my feelings because I wasn't telling anyone in my world, of course, what I was going through. Everyone thought we had the perfect life together. It looked like a fairy tale on the outside. So I found the journals very helpful until he found them and basically used them against me to make me believe that he finally had understood what he was doing and taken responsibility.
And so you did move back, and he had agreed to alcohol counseling, and it only took about 2 more nights, and you had a couple over for dinner. And there was an incident that happened that night.
There was. We'd invited friends over to dinner to our house, and during dinner, he started to move outside the contract he had with the alcohol counselor for how many drinks he would drink. And I knew we were on a really bad path, Peter, that night. No one had ever seen him become physically abusive with me before. I had done a really good job of managing that situation. And that night he started drinking and he didn't stop. And after dinner, my guests and they all moved to the bar to have after dinner drinks, because during dinner drinks weren't enough, evidently. That they moved in to have after dinner drinks, and I was feeding my dogs. I had 4 dogs, and one of them was this big, beautiful, stupid, I loved him, but stupid Akita. I mean, he was just lovely, but aggressive, and only believed I was the only person in the world that he had to listen to. Anyway, I fed him out on the back step, and unbeknownst to me, the woman that was there that night for dinner had gone out another back door, gone into the backyard, reached over to pet the dog, bit him while he was petted him while he was eating, and he bit her. He bit her right on the cheek. So there was a stressor, and he didn't do well with stressors, and he just exploded that night.
And this was your then husband who exploded.
Yes.
And tell us what happened next.
So he was a gun guy. We had this bookshelf in our bedroom that pushed back, much like the one behind you, Peter, and it pushed back, and there was a gun safe behind it, big walk-in gun safe. It was an armory, basically, because he loved weapons. He got a loaded .45. I was in the kitchen. My guests were in the bathroom looking at her cheek. He came into the kitchen and was swearing and yelling and telling me that he was going to kill the dog. And I panicked and ran around the island, this big granite island in the kitchen, and threw myself basically in front of him and basically wrestled the gun away from him. And he was drunk enough. He was a big man, but strong, but he was drunk enough that I got the gun from him, unloaded the gun. It was very tense. And then he took off to the back of the house yelling and screaming and throwing things and having a temper tantrum. And so I got to my guests and I asked them to please get her to the hospital, take her to the ER, have her cheek looked at. And they didn't want to leave me. They actually said, "Are you sure you want us to go?" Because they heard him yelling. And I said, "No, please, you need to get her medical attention." And so I walked them to their car, and then I came back in and I got a leather dog leash, and I found the Akita, and I walked him to a corner of the property where I could tie him to a tree with a leash, with a long lead. And then I came back in the house. And as I was coming back in the house through the garage, my husband was there waiting for me. And he grabbed me and he grabbed the leash out of my hands, and he put the leash around my throat, and he attempted to strangle me with the dog lead.
And you struggled and were able to free yourself. And you finally said for the first time that you were going to call the police on him.
Yeah. I mean, I felt myself going. I felt my air leaving my lungs, and I got my fingers between the cross and the dog leash. And I told him, "If you don't stop, I'll call the police." I had never said anything like that before. And even in his drunken rage, it penetrated. You could see him stop. And he stopped, and he dropped the dog leash. And then he picked me up by my shoulders. According to the photos the next day, it was about 8 inches off the ground. He picked me up by my shoulders, and he beat the back of my head against the wall until I started to black out. And the last thing I remember was he licked my face the way a dog would. And then I woke up on the floor.
And then you ended up in a guest room in your house with your dogs, and you locked yourself in there.
I did.
And hid from him.
I did, Peter. I wish I could say that some survival instinct had kicked in, but it hadn't. When I came to, he had turned up the music real loud, which he liked to do when he was drinking heavily. And all I could think was to get the other 3 dogs and take them with me. And I locked us in a guest room and shut off the lights.
And at some point in the morning, he barged through the door with the equivalent of a police flashlight, and shined the flashlight in your face, and you thought that something very bad was about to happen.
I did. At about, I think it was 3 o'clock that morning, I was watching an alarm clock that had the numbers that flipped on it. I remember that so vividly. He came in and he shined this flash. He broke through the door, shined the flashlight on me, kissed me on the top of the head, and said he was done with me and goodbye. And I was completely convinced that he was going to shoot me that night. And I was so numb and so demoralized that I couldn't even find it in myself to leave. I just sat there with my dogs and waited.
And you waited until the next morning, and then you heard him leave the house.
I did.
And then he called you and ultimately told you that he was going helicopter skiing with a bunch of his buddies and told you, you better not be gone when I get back.
That's exactly what he did. He was scheduled to go helicopter skiing with buddies, and he left that morning at about 8 o'clock. I was awake that night, the whole night. He left at 8 o'clock, called me from the charter company and said, you better be there when I get back, and told me it was my fault that I let him drink.
And then you finally, after how you described it to me, after basically froze for a couple of days, and then you finally reached out to a friend, and that took a lot of courage as well, because of the fact, like you said, to all of the outside world, you had a beautiful fairy tale life. And so besides being afraid, you were also ashamed. And so that took extra guts. And you called a friend and said, this is what's going on in my life. And your friend was a psychologist.
Yeah, she was. She was wonderful, Peter. She called and she could hear it in my voice. There was something there, right? And I said, I need to see you. And she said, I'm canceling my afternoon clients. Meet me at the office. So I met her at the office and I told her what had happened the night before. And she said, I don't even know how to diagnose that behavior. She said, you need to leave before he kills you.
And you did leave, and you moved to Nevada.
I did. I was very frightened after I left. Understandably so. I took a consulting job out of state just for a sense of safety. And I moved away and filed for divorce.
And during the divorce proceedings, at one point, he did convince you to go to a joint counseling session. And it was at that time that one of the counselors referred to you as a battered woman.
Correct.
And that was something that was a little bit jarring for you, to be classified as that. And then they asked you to go to battered women's therapy, which you did.
They did. The therapists were highly skilled. It was a male-female, as a husband and wife team, actually. And I would not tell them why we were there. I insisted that he tell them. And as soon as he disclosed the level of violence, they said, couples counseling is contraindicated. We're going to end this counseling session. And they did. And he actually escorted me with the police to the airport and told me not to come back until I was safe. So it was the first time that someone told me that I was a battered wife and called me a battered woman. And it was hard to hear, but I followed their advice and I stayed away and I finished the divorce.
And at some point you moved back to Idaho, and we'll try to, we're going to go through a number of years, and you actually had a little baby girl who's now a girl who's zooming into her class as a 12-year-old.
That's right.
And at the time when you saw that little baby, you were telling me that you thought back to when you were little, and you wanted to protect not just yourself anymore, but to protect this baby. And you started to read about and to research intergenerational transmission of violence. And that's what led you to your work as a researcher and the work that you did at the College of Idaho.
Yes, that's right. So at that point, I had started to do research on the warning signs of a potentially violent relationship, because I believed that we could teach it as basically as primary prevention. And after my daughter was born, I had done a lot of work on the relationship violence I'd experienced in my marriage, but I had never gone back and dealt with the childhood sexual assault. And after my daughter was born, I was determined to do everything I could to help the cycle of violence end with me and not pass on to her. And it was going back to the roots of that early violence for me that really allowed me to do the therapeutic work I needed to finally end the cycle of violence in my own life and to heal completely. And I feel that I have.
And you've then taken your journey and your healing and are now trying to do that to help others. And we were talking about the fact that you started to do work at the College of Idaho. You started a men's and women's counseling center there. And then that work ended up translating into your being invited to panels and give talks and speeches. And you started to realize that there was a pattern when you would give a speech that people would line up. And instead of somebody having just one question after your speech, they would line up and they all wanted to tell you their own personal stories. Exactly. And you started to realize that this was a lot of this, this was consistent with and reminded you a lot of your own journals that you used to write. And that's what started you into narrative therapy, and you started what's called the Voices Protocol.
We did. So I worked with my board, a group of clinical psychologists, DA, chief of police. There was a multidisciplinary group, and we developed a narrative therapy protocol that helps people who have been through those types of experience move through the process of telling their story. First, the victimization, what they experienced, and then how they became survivors and ended the violence in their own lives. And then we move it on to what we call the heroic phase, where we ask them to reflect back on the positive growth and transformation that they have experienced as a result of those traumatic and violent experiences. And talk basically about how they've become the heroes of their own lives and stories once again.
Yeah, because when you and I were talking recently, you talked about, you painted a beautiful picture about how every human being, from the time that they can actually start to form their own thoughts, creates their own narrative about the way they want their life to go. They want to become an astronaut or a princess or a doctor or the president of the United States, and or a professional athlete. Right. But when people are victimized, a traumatic incident hijacks their narrative instantly.
That's right.
And you talked about the fact that this narrative therapy gives people the power to rewrite and take back their narrative and write the way that the narrative is supposed to go again.
Right. It's a process of reclamation. It's a process of reclaiming their stories when crime basically took their stories away for a period of time. It's one of the reasons why I'm working with Marsy's Law and why I love this work so much, is because Marsy's Law is such an important part. What this initiative seeks to do is to help the criminal justice process be facilitative for victims in that reclamation process rather than re-victimizing.
And you actually wrote a book called Voices of Hope that was distributed nationally. And you're taking that and working with victims in Idaho with your work in Marsy's Law. Could you tell us about the Idaho Voices of Hope project?
So what we're doing here, when I first came on, I was asked to help reunite the victim service groups and then to reach out to storytellers. And so my board and I got together with our principal investigator, and we decided that in addition to my work, we wanted to donate a version of Voices of Hope to Idahoans. And so we're doing that, working with Marsy's Law as a co-sponsor to create Voices of Hope, Idahoans telling the story of victims of crime, basically. And we're working with these storytellers in a very supportive process to talk about how they've moved through victimization and survivorship into being once again the heroes of their own lives and stories, and using it as a teaching tool. And then we're donating it back to the victim service providers in Idaho as a fundraising effort.
And with another researcher, a very renowned researcher in this area, you're also writing another book. You're in the process of writing another book having to do with the 14 warning signs of violence. Could you tell us briefly about that project as well?
So our nonprofit's called A Frog in the Pot because we teach off the metaphor of a live frog in a pot of boiling water will stay, but if you slowly turn up the heat, or excuse me, a live frog in a pot of boiling water will die. But if you turn up the heat slowly, the frog, I have totally messed up this metaphor, Peter. I'm gonna move on. Anyway, it's related to the teaching metaphor about the frog in the pot and how if the temperature of the water increases slowly, like violence does in relationships, basically, that people will die in these relationships. And so we're calling the book Before the Boil. And it's the research we've been doing for the last 14 years about what the early warning signs of a potentially violent relationship are, so we can teach it as primary prevention to young people.
Well, we all look forward to that, and the research that you have done has been so exhaustive. You've been telling me about the years that it has taken to get this to where it is. We all look forward to that. Thank you so much for condensing your incredible story into 30 minutes. We could be here for a lot longer to really delve into some of the details. And thanks for sharing what is, I don't think, ever an easy story to tell. I don't think these become any less difficult in their retelling. But not just sharing your story with us, but also sharing your talents with everyone in the victims' rights world, and sharing your talents with all of us at Marsy's Law. And also enabling and empowering all of the victims to be able to take back their narrative and tell their stories, just like you did today, and to become the heroes of their own stories. Thanks so much for the work that you do and for working with all of us.
Thank you, Peter. It's my privilege, truly.
And thanks so much for joining us today. And we will see you. We'll see you live at some Marsy's Law event once we can all get back and travel again.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.